I'm Alexis.
And I'm Emma.
And we're here to teach you something today.
That was a fun little tune.
Thank you. And what are we going to be talking about today, Emma?
Mental disability is an illness, which is a much deeper topic in both modern times and during the Great Depression.
Indeed, which this topic can be related back to a book we recently read too, right? What was it called?
I believe the name was Of Mice and Men.
Oh yeah, that's right. That book had a lot of themes in it while thinking back. Not only was it heavily about mental disability, with one of our main characters, Lenny, but there were many other themes as well.
You're right. It delved into important topics such as loneliness and the American dream. Most importantly, certain themes having to do with mental disability, racial issues, equality, sexism, and many more. The author certainly knew what he was talking about, or writing about, I should say.
He definitely did. Though, I think mental disability played a huge part in the story simply because Lenny was one of the main characters.
That's true. We can infer that Lenny had to deal with autism, which during those times in the Great Depression, if you weren't like everyone else, you weren't accepted and were treated poorly.
Sadly, that's very true. That's why we believe that the theme statement of Of Mice and Men would be,
While mental illness or disabilities may be a burden, it doesn't define someone for who they are. Well said. Can we get some examples of what times were like during the Great Depression and how the disabled were treated?
Certainly. During those times, overtly physically or developmentally disabled children were either cared for by individual families or excluded from local society. In 1773, New York passed a law permitting the denial of settlement to the mentally ill, or, if they were already residents, compelling their families to see to their care. So, basically, disabled folks were separated from society at all times due to their conditions, and were sometimes even denied to stay at certain places.
Wow, that is truly awful how disabled people were treated back then, when honestly they couldn't do a thing about it. Did times change back then at all, or get better for disabled people?
Luckily, things did, but only at the end of the 20th century. The last decades of the 20th century increased the magnitude of federal programs to protect the rights of people with disabilities in such areas as employment, education, public transportation, and building accessibility. So luckily, even if not during the Great Depression, around that time people were taking a step forward to create equal rights for the disabled and to protect them, which affected modern times today actually and how their disabilities don't define that person.
Well, it's good to hear that during the Great Depression, things took a turn for the better. But you also mentioned that affected modern times today. Would you mind if I delved into that for a moment?
Absolutely, please do.
Well, as having a half-brother who has autism, I can say that while it might be hard to understand or deal with sometimes, it doesn't mean he's less intelligent, kind, or human. My half-brother is actually very smart and has more compassion than a lot of people I know. He does his best and has so much motivation, even when he's facing the tide of society. He will help any animal or person in need, and when someone is upset or stressed, he does anything he can do to make them happy. He's actually kind of famous back where I used to live. Everyone knows him and will stop to say hi and chat it up.
That's so neat. I actually didn't know you had a half-brother with autism, but hearing his accomplishments and your stories really is incredible.
Exactly, and even though he has autism, which can be a challenge to get certain things done, it does not define him because he has accomplished so many things in such a short time. He loves to draw, sculpt with clay, and exercise. My hometown hosts a Special Olympics once in a while, and he won a gold medal. His drawing and sculpting has got the attention of many of the people in our town, so they often ask him to make things for them. He's even offered a job at DreamWorks for it, but he turned it down because he didn't want to spend any time away from the family. He's such a wonderful person, and I'm so proud of him.
Wow, your half-brother is the perfect example of how disabilities don't define a person with mental illness or disability. It's a good example of how modern-day disabilities are dealt with rather than back then. I'm glad that he's able to do what he'd like without society saying he can't because he has autism.
Definitely. Though it does bring me back to later times again, to mental disabilities during the Great Depression, and how hard it must have been without being able to protect their rights and be treated fairly, especially in Of Mice and Men.
I heavily agree. Lenny couldn't be treated as fairly as some due to side characters not understanding his condition, and that having a disability during that time defined him as not smart or dopey, which isn't true at all. Lenny was simply forgetful at times, but was trying his best.
Yeah, and truly the only one to see Lenny for who he was George. He had been with Lenny for so long that he understood him as a person and helped him through his trials. He explains this when telling some of their story. Him and me was both born in Auburn. I know his Aunt Clara. She took him in when he was a baby and raised him up. When his Aunt Clara died, Lenny just come along with me out working. Kinda got used to each other after a while.
Very true. And throughout the story, even when Lenny messes up or does something bad, George is always there to help him, protect him, defend him, and be there for him. A good example is after Curly's hand had been crushed in the story. "Christ almighty, I hate to have you mad at me," Slim said. George broke in. "Lenny was just scared," he explained. "He didn't know what to do. I told you nobody ever ought to fought him."
George had always been there to defend Lenny for sure, but another good example would be of Candy. Despite only knowing him for a few days, Candy tried his best to defend Lenny in any way he could, not only when he gets blamed for Curly's hand, but also to cover for him after the death of Curly's wife. We ought to let him get away. You don't know that Curly. Curly gonna want him to get him lynched. Curly will want him killed.
In conclusion, after reading through and listening to all of these articles, just proves how during history and in the story of Mice and Men, how disabled people aren't defined by their disabilities, but rather by how they act and treat other people.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something today through our theme statement and stories.
Bye! Oh. That was so good. My laugh.